Hi everyone, and welcome to a design framework for reflective play. We're going to be talking about good ways in which to make effective reflective games, which are games that get their players to reflect on either their in-game behavior or reflect on larger things such as themselves or the world around them. We think that games are a great way of getting players to reflect because, games are very involved. People spend a lot of time with games, and games might have contexts that are relevant to a person's life. Before we go further into that, though, what is reflection? It's a complex psychological process, and there's a lot of competing definitions. So we created a working definition for this paper specifically. We talk about reflection as looking at things in a new way, looking at things in a way that supports the development of new insights or creates changes in values, judgments, or maybe even behavior. And there is a lot of evidence that players reflect with games and even transform within them. In terms of transformation, there's endo-transformation, which is changing your behaviors within a game. And then there's also exo-transformation, which is changes outside of a game, such as changes in one's own behavior. It's worth noting that exo-transformation is rarer, and that's doubly true for more complex forms of exotransformation, such as real changes in your views towards complex social systems or changes in larger behavior. But it has happened in the academic literature. So there are a lot of games that have been built to explore, that have been built to get their players to reflect. Games that explore leadership skills, healthy dating behaviors, sexism in the workplace, and work-life balance, along with other examples. And then outside of academic literature, there are arguably hundreds of games that were designed to, or that do get their players to reflect, and our paper goes into a lot of those examples. In terms of how to actually design for reflection, building on other work, a lot of reflective design is breaking away from traditional game design ideas. For example, for a lot of game designers, immersion is key. You want your player to be very immersed in the world. But for reflective design, that doesn't really help a player think about the real world and think about how their behaviors in games and the things that they're learning in a game can be transferred to the real world. Similarly, a designer might want to hide the fact that it's, in some ways a learning game because they want the player to just play it for fun. But being explicit about the fact that it's a learning game, that it's a reflective game, can prime the player to think reflectively. Of course, you don't want to directly tell the player what to think. At that point, you might as well write an essay. And then finally, one risky approach is making the player uncomfortable. Obviously, if done poorly, a player will turn away from the game or shut down. But if done well, making a player uncomfortable can be an effective way of getting a player to think about, why am I uncomfortable? What does this mean? How can I resolve these feelings? So our motivation was to take a lot of the work that has been done on reflection and reflective play, and we wanted to create very specific and very actionable tools for designers. And so in order to do that, this paper is in some ways a literature review. It's a literature review of papers in psychology, papers in game design, but also game design articles, videos, and games that have been successful in causing reflection. And so through this process, we broke reflection down into a series of phases. Now, let's be clear. We're not creating a new psychological theory here. We're not saying this is exactly what happens. What we're saying is this is a good way of thinking about reflection, and thinking through the various phases of reflection can help a designer really narrow down what they want to do. So during gameplay, a player might be faced with a disruption, which is an event that primes them to reflect, followed by a slowdown, a slower part of the gameplay in which they can actually do the cognition, do the thinking. There's questioning, which is the questions that a player is asking themselves as they are reflecting. And all of that leads to reflection in action, which is the reflection that's actually done during during the action of the gameplay process. After a gameplay experience, there might be revisiting, which is recalling an experience earlier in the game, which leads to reflection on action, reflecting on the actions that you took previously in a game. And then there are enhancers. Enhancers take reflection and help you think about it in broader context. So it might take your behavior within a game and then help you think about it in the real world or in broader contexts like that. And so all of this reflection in action and on action can potentially lead to transformation. The transformation that I mentioned earlier of endotransformation, which is in-game behavior change, or exotransformation, real-world behavior change. I mentioned earlier, sorry. So all of these phases of reflection, we created a variety of design patterns that are associated with each phase of reflection. And so each pattern is a specific design element that a designer can implement into their game that supports each phase of reflection. Now, I mentioned earlier that we wanted these tools to be specific and actionable. And so for that, we turned each pattern into a card in a card deck. So for example, this is the card for attention as a mechanic. Each card has a short description of the pattern. It has genres that the pattern would be good with and other patterns that pair well with the pattern in question. It has instructions for utilizing the pattern, questions that a designer can ask themselves during the design process, and finally, examples of games that have worked effectively in the past utilizing that pattern. And so this card deck is meant to be much more approachable to designers. A designer can just draw cards, shuffle the deck and draw cards during the design process to quickly get ideas on patterns that they can implement. It is a little bit rough. We did translate the paper into this card deck, but we'd like to do more iteration with designers to get this card deck into an even more approachable and an even more usable state. So we don't have time to go through every single pattern, but we can go over them broadly. Within disruptions, there are dissonance patterns. Dissonance patterns are about creating a divide between what the player expects and what they believe, creating a divide between that and what actually happens. So, for example, a narrative twist might involve a player expecting something to happen in the narrative and then, suddenly something else is happening. And so by creating that divide, a player might wonder why their expectations were broken in a certain way. There are also patterns of discomfort, like involving emotional challenge within a game. As mentioned before, discomfort is risky, but when utilized effectively, discomfort puts players in a place to reflect on why they feel uncomfortable and how to resolve those feelings. Within slowdowns, there are speed bumps, which are mechanics that get a player to, slow down. For example, there might be heavy wind buffeting the player's character. That way they can't progress as quickly as they want, and they spend a little bit of time thinking about earlier disruptions that have happened. There are stasis patterns, which are a little more direct. They directly stop the player, such as via a cutscene, from taking actions. And then there are stillness patterns. Stillness patterns don't do anything specific, but they're more about the aesthetics. They're more about creating an environment that is serene and restful, an environment in which the player feels comfortable taking a moment and thinking about earlier disruptions. Questioning patterns are all about absurdity and creating ambiguity that the player has to resolve by reflecting on the game. These do have some overlap with disruption patterns, but the difference is that disruption patterns are more about singular events, whereas questioning patterns are more about the gameplay as a whole. Questioning also involves hypothesis testing, which is giving the player options in which to try certain things out, really test the systems of the game, and spaces in which to do that kind of exploration. There are no sub-patterns within revisiting, but revisiting is all about creating visualizations or creating opportunities for players to look back at previous experiences within the game or previous actions that they took. That way they can look at these experiences in a new light and, maybe say, oh, I did something wrong, or, something of that sort. And then finally, enhancer patterns. One of the most direct enhancement patterns is the just direct encouragement of reflection, saying, hey, why did you make that decision? Why do you think the things you do? A previous pattern was confrontation, and encouragement of reflection is similar to confrontation, but it is different in the sense that an encouragement of reflection can be very positive. It doesn't have to be painful to the player. There's breaking the fourth wall, which is referring to the real world and referring to the actual player. And that can get players who are thinking about their behavior and action within a game to start thinking in a broader sense, to think about the world and how the game relates to the world. And finally, there's social discourse, which is creating avenues for players to chat with other players, maybe via text, maybe via voice, or maybe a forum, in which players can say, oh, this is what I just experienced. Have other people experienced this? What do they think about it? So using these patterns to illustrate how these patterns might actually be used in the design process, our paper creates the design of a game from scratch called Hospitality. This is a game that's all about medical ethics and the possible conundrums of running a hospital. Now, obviously, the paper goes much more into detail about how this game would be designed and how it would utilize the patterns, but we can do an abridged version here. So the game designer might see Hospitality as a sort of simulator game or a management style game, like Roller Coaster Tycoon, where you you create this hospital and you're in charge of running it and in charge of making the decisions on what should be implemented within the hospital. So as the designer is in the design process, maybe they're randomly drawing cards from the deck and they draw genre subversion. Well, typically in this genre, you build something and then it provides passive income. Well, maybe in Hospitality, getting income is a manual process. There's nothing automatic. So if you want to bill a patient, you have to make that paperwork yourself, and you have to be very confronted with the possible exploitation that you're leveraging upon someone if you're overcharging them. Similarly, the pattern of waiting mechanics can be used, where the billing process is very slow, giving players time to reflect on the charges that they are levying upon a hypothetical patient. A designer might be designing and they might draw the confrontation card and think about how confrontation could be implemented in this game. What if the designer writes in a reporter that asks, hey, how did you make these decisions? Why did you choose the things you did in your hospital? And then they might draw the card on reflective revisiting, where and they might think, oh, well, instead of the reporter just publishing, what if a few hours later your answers are published? That way you can see your previous answer and think to yourself, have my views changed? Would I answer this differently? So, in conclusion, we wanted to coalesce the various ideas on reflective play into a specific and actionable set of tools. In order to do so, we broke reflection down into various phases. For each phase, we created a set of design patterns, and then we converted those design patterns into a card deck that we intend to iterate on, and we intend to do some, play testing. But yeah, thank you to Daniel Cook for looking at a previous version of this. Thank you to SlidesGo for creating this PowerPoint template. And thank you to y'all for watching this presentation. Have a wonderful Kai.